Sergeant Bruce Porter, United States Air Force, Vietnam. I've known Bruce for many years. We've been friends throughout the years, and I had the good fortune to interview him. We sat down and talked about Vietnam. It was April 6, 2007. I was in Longmont, Colorado, interviewing veterans, and Bruce stepped forward. He enlisted into the military. He went to Vietnam at 19 years of age, 2 tours, 70, 71, 72. He was assigned to a fighter bomber base in Vietnam and worked with an avionics squadron, and really tells one of the best stories of Vietnam that I have. If you're looking for history and looking for what happened in Vietnam and the mood of the country, he told me he volunteered to serve his country. He felt a duty to serve his country. And I just respect Bruce. Bruce is still with us, living in the Denver area. I want to thank Michael Sarofsky again for sponsoring a video. Michael, thank you, sir, for making it possible for others to learn about Vietnam through Bruce's story. Thank you for your support of my work and your compassion for our country and our veterans. I really appreciate it, Michael. Thank you. Folks, Bruce's story, like I said, is very enlightening. There's a lot of history here, and I'm just blessed to be able to call him my friend, and I think you're going to learn a lot through this interview. If you'd like to sponsor a video like Michael has, there's information in the video description below the video. On my website, larrycapetto.com, click on Sponsor a Vet. And if you want to donate to my work, you can do so through the comments section of this video. Voices of History Radio is going strong. Like I said, almost 40 countries now have been listening to my radio station. 24/7, folks. Get in on it. Share it with somebody. Our students need to hear the living history here. They need to know why they're free, and their stories are the truth of why they're free are embedded in these stories, and you know that, those of you that are watching this channel and listening to the radio station. So I invite you to click over to Voices of History Radio, and appreciate it. So that's it for now. I don't think there's anything else. So I appreciate you out there watching these videos. A lot of you binge watch these videos, but you know, I really want to thank those who have supported my work. That's what means that there's where my heart's at right there. You've seen the importance of these stories, and I really appreciate that. And I take a moment just to thank you again. You know who you are, and I know God will honor that and bless you for it. So anyways, thank you for subscribing and sharing this channel, and I will talk to you again in a future broadcast. God bless you. Let's do it again. In country, 69 to 72. You said?
Well, I'm trying to think. It was 70 to 72.
Okay, that's okay.
Yeah, that works.
Now, I forget, you were drafted, you told me, right?
No, I volunteered for the Air Force.
And at that time in the country, what was the mood, you think, about Vietnam and your thoughts about it at the time that you actually went in?
Well, at the time that I joined the Air Force, and then after training, I volunteered for Vietnam. The mood of the country at the time was just beginning to really turn against the war. And I was gung-ho. I wanted to serve. I wanted to, be in on the action and be there to serve. And so I volunteered to go over. While I was there, we saw the mood of the country begin to change. And even over there, we began to hear reports about protests back home and people that were burning the flag and spitting on some of our veterans that were coming back home, and it was really discouraging at the very least. But I became kind of disillusioned after the first year or so. I actually enlisted for another tour over there, and then right after that I became really disillusioned.
Now, again, you hear a lot of things about Vietnam, and they call it, or when I say they, it's been referred to as an unpopular war. Why do you think that is?
I think Vietnam was an unpopular war because the people who sent us there, the politicians, didn't communicate effectively to the American people what the conflict was really all about. Very few people really understood what the ramifications of communist expansionism would mean to us as Americans. And Vietnam was so far away that most people just didn't really pay close attention to it because it didn't impact their personal lives.
Well said. Yeah, and as far as the actual conflict and our purpose for being there, communism, the spread of communism, like you said, that was the main fear of the government or whatever as to why we even went there initially. Well, we were involved a lot years before, whereas advisors were there and things like this. Even back in the 50s, wasn't there, or do you know much history of?
The French had an interest in Southeast Asia for quite a few years before our first advisors actually began showing up over there in the 60s. And there was sort of a consensus, I think, among a lot of the Western powers that communist expansionism in Vietnam, especially the kind that they were hearing about in North Vietnam, where literally Marxism, Leninism was taking over and expanding into the surrounding countries of Cambodia, Laos, and South Vietnam. It looked like a credible threat to the Western powers, and a lot of people, were concerned about that because there was also a lot of information coming in about the Soviet bloc supplying arms and training for the North Vietnamese. So it was really kind of a threat that seemed credible enough to send troops over there, I'm sure, to President Kennedy when he finally committed troops, and then later, of course, with Johnson and Richard Nixon, who ended the war.
I'm kind of going ahead, and we'll come back, but why do you think the country was so divided? I mean, where did that come from? Unlike World War II, where we were behind the war effort, women were working in factories and rationing and everything. What do you think happened between World War II? Maybe we started to see it in Korea and then Vietnam, and we became so divisive.
It appears to me that over a number of years, radicals, and particularly leftist radicals, gained control of our college campuses and a good portion of our national news media, which kind of steers the national opinion of the people. As time went on, and in that era around the 60s when we had the Flower Power movement and we had the peace movement, leftist radicalism was really in ascendancy in our country, and that translated into a built-in sympathy on the part of the protesters for this ideal of Marxism bringing about the perfect society, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And so there was a kind of an appeal among idealistic young people on the campuses to embrace the idea of socialism. This ran counter to, of course, the more conservative members of our society who thought that communism wasn't that great of an idea, and we really didn't want to go in that direction. But they were cast in the popular media as being sort of old fogies and really people who are out of step with the prevailing sort of evolution of culture, so to speak.
When you went to Vietnam, I asked you this last week, but I forget what you said. I think I asked you, but when you went in country the first time, what do you remember about that? And was the geography of Vietnam what you thought it would have been, or what were your thoughts about it?
Vietnam was scary when I landed because we had a fighter escort for our aircraft as we flew in, from the United States. And of course, when we landed at Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Saigon, we had a cordon of, security troops around us as we came in, and began to get our assignments and start to move out to where we were going to be based. And, of course, as a young man of only 19 years old at the time, it was a scary prospect to step into a war zone because you didn't know what to expect. It was exciting, but it was also kind of scary and intriguing at the same time.
And you were with the Air Force.
Yes.
Give me the unit you were with and your rank at the time.
I was a sergeant assigned to a fighter bomber base at Bien Hoa, just north of Saigon initially. At the time, it was the busiest airport in the world because we had more aircraft operations in and out of that place than any commercial airport in the world. I was in an avionics squadron. I worked on the avionics of fighter bombers of various kinds. And you know, we were behind secure lines mostly. I mean, as an Air Force personnel, we weren't really involved in combat operations or on the ground pounding kind of things. But we were subject to almost daily at times rocket and mortar barrages from the Viet Cong outside of our base. And so we lived basically next to a bomb shelter constantly.
As far as what was happening in Vietnam at the time, are you aware of the engagements, I'm assuming up north from where you're at, and what is going on in Vietnam at the time of the war, and what kind of reports or happenings would you guys be made aware of as far as the war itself, or how bad it was and things like that?
We weren't really that aware of what was going on in other parts of the country, except the sort of scuttlebutt that you'd hear among the guys, you know, when they would come in from operations. It's not like today, you know, you don't have instant news media and internet and email. And so we weren't really all that aware of what was happening in other parts of the country, except what we heard through the Armed Forces radio network and what little news we received that way. But that was pretty minimal.
Who was taking off from this air base? I mean, were these, when they call airstrikes in these areas, was it the guys would take off from where you're at, the jets and all that?
Our primary mission at Benoit, in the unit I was in, was a forward air controller squadron. We flew O-1s, O-2, OV-10s, the Broncos, and the A-37s, the twin Tweety Bird jet, we called it. And our primary mission was to go out and actually identify targets for the heavy metal that basically we would call in through smoke grenades or sophisticated radio connections, and you know, bring in the heavy guns on targets that we would identify.
Would any of your aircraft carry Napalm or Agent Orange or anything like that?
Oh yeah, they didn't carry, as far as I'm aware, Agent Orange, but they did carry napalm on occasion for missions, especially the Tweety Birds. Those were the A-37 jets. And of course they had some limited weaponry on them, but our guys were mostly involved in forward air controlling. So they were basically flying low and slow and identifying targets, and then giving feedback to some of the other fighter bombers and so forth that were bringing in the bombs and the heavy metal on the targets.
How about helicopters? Do they go in and out of the base?
We did. We had a lot of flight operations. We were right next to the 101st Airborne Division, which was just outside of the Benoit base there. And so we'd have, you know, hundreds of helicopters coming in and out, you know, from operations out in the field every day.
Hueys or Chinooks or Cobras or what?
Hueys and Cobras for the most part. We had a few Chinooks coming in, you know, that would bring in heavy equipment and, you know, resupply. And we had a few Loach helicopters. They were the light helicopters, and they were equipped with miniguns. They were basically guys that would go in and support ground troops, you know, close and hot. You know, they would get into the firefights quite a bit.
As far as your particular job, you said avionics. Did you work on aircraft or?
I worked on aircraft, repaired the avionics in them, kept them basically, you know, up to speed and so forth. We would repair battle damage, you know, or just ordinary wear and tear on the aircraft. And you know, as part of my MOS, I was able to go out and fly with the guys occasionally, and you know, do things like that. But I wasn't a pilot. That wasn't my purpose there.
Was there camaraderie with the guys that you were with in the Air Force on that base?
There was, yeah. We had a lot of close friendships and stuff. You know, when you were off duty, you know, you partied with the guys and tried to spend as much time, you know, decompressing as you could. I think what made it difficult is, you know, what made it difficult sometimes is when you get close to somebody and you see them get hurt. We didn't see that as much as some of the real combat guys, the Army grunts and the Marines that went in on the ground. But we did see occasionally, you know, some pretty horrendous casualties from some of these rockets and mortars that would come in. And of course, when they hit somebody or they do damage, it's pretty gory, pretty bad.
Do you think maybe among those that you're with, or just Vietnam in general, do you think there was a strong purpose for being there? Or you hear stories about, you mentioned about becoming a little disillusioned about things, but do you think that possibly had an effect on the outcome, or the morale there? Is the purpose, was there a defined purpose for being there
Well,
that was being communicated to the troops?
that was one of the failures of the military commanders, and I think even the politicians. As troops, I wasn't aware that we were really being told, why we were there or what the purpose of it was. It was only after the war that I really understood what that conflict was all about. And so as a result of that, many of us became demoralized. We saw a lot of the troops get into drug and alcoholism and drug use, and it was discouraging because we felt, and we could see it on the ground, and we could see it really in our operations, that we were being micromanaged by politicians. They weren't letting us win the war. We were all aware that we could win, and we could win quickly, because we had such an advantage just in terms of sheer firepower and technology. But we were being micromanaged to a degree that we weren't allowed to really have those decisive victories, and part of that reason was the constant presence of reporters that were telling the story back home. And of course, blood and guts is part of war. It's a horrible, horrible enterprise. It's one of the great evils of mankind, and it's not a pretty thing. Anybody who's been in combat can tell you that. But it's a necessary evil when you have a situation where if you're in a war, there's no option. You have to win. You can't just go in and do a police operation. If you want to do that, send police in. But if you want to send the army in, the purpose of the army is to kill people and break things and end the war as quickly as possible, because in the long run, that saves lives. At the time, we couldn't see that. That was sort of, murky in our thinking, when we were feeling like everything we did was being criticized at home, and when we talked to people at home, they just, we were sort of treated as fools. I know I was. When I came home from Vietnam, it was a no-talk rule almost. We didn't get the parades. We didn't get the attaboys from the folks at home. If anything, people seemed to be ashamed of us as veterans. And that made us feel ashamed, for what had happened. And then, of course, all we ever heard about in the news media was, the My Lies and, the abuses of American soldiers, which wasn't as pervasive as, of course, people were being given the impression it was. A lot of our guys were very compassionate in the field, and they weren't just cruel warmongers in every case. That happened, yeah. I mean, you get thousands of guys together, you're going to have some bad apples in the group. But for the most part, the American soldier has always shown himself, and that includes Vietnam, as being a compassionate warrior for his country who is there because he has to be, not because he loves war.
What was some of the good that came out of Vietnam, or during the actual conflict or the war over there? I mean, you hear about the bad things, but what was some of the good stuff that was happening? Like today in Iraq, there's a lot of good happening, but we're not hearing about it.
Well, I was personally involved for a time in a group called Civic Actions. And part of our team's operation on the side was we would take excess material and construction material and so forth out into the field, and we would actually help build monasteries. We would help build schools. Did anybody in America ever hear about that? I doubt it. But we were literally risking our lives going out into some of these villages, doing what we called civic actions, trying to win the hearts and minds of the folks there, that we weren't all just monsters, and doing water projects and road projects and so forth for them. Often we would come under fire while we were doing it.
So we're fighting the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese in Vietnam. That's the enemies that we're fighting, basically?
Yeah, we were fighting the Viet Cong and the South Vietnamese sympathizers, of course, who were ideologically in agreement, with the North Vietnamese. But it was a hard war for us because we were also fighting enemies at home who were basically betraying us. And one of the best examples of that, of course, is Hanoi Jane, who went to North Vietnam and betrayed our prisoners of war. And she was only one example of a number of people that were doing that kind of thing. And so that was demoralizing, it was discouraging.
What was the most difficult thing about what you had to do in Vietnam during the time you were there?
I think the most difficult thing I had to deal with was helping some of the guys after we had some particularly bad hits from rocket income. Incoming rockets were sort of surprises from the North Vietnamese. We'd be asleep in the middle of the night, and the sirens would go off, and 3 or 4 seconds later, the rockets would start to fall. Well, I saw guys that would jump up and try to run to the bunkers and get killed. I learned after a while that it was futile to try and run to the bunkers because you're exposing yourself. It's better to just stay where you are and try to take cover and get as low as possible. But there were times when it was pretty terrifying. I have one memory during a particularly bad rocket attack when you could hear them coming in just one after another, and they were landing everywhere. You couldn't tell where the next one was coming down. And I fell on the floor and literally flopped around like a fish. I was so terrified that the next one was going to come through the roof. And that's how most of our guys got hurt. Because all we had above us in these hooches were just this, it was a tin roof, corrugated. So.
Was there, like in the field with a lot of the guys, their big thing was when they're going to leave country, they'd count down the days, you'd come in new, and then you'd receive your baptism under fire, and you'd grow up in a hurry and all this stuff, and then towards the end, it's like, was it like that in the Air Force with you guys? Was there a particular time, that it was time to go home, and that was your motivation maybe to get through all of it, or?
Yeah, we called it getting short. And the shorter we'd get, we'd count the days down. And, you get a little nervous as you start getting shorter and shorter because you want to get out of this alive. You don't want to die in this situation or get hurt or disabled in some way. But we'd always talk about the freedom birds. And my last assignment, at the very last of my tour, I was at Phan Rang Air Base near the coast. And when the Freedom Bird took off, it was right toward the end of the campaign. The Viet Cong started mortaring the base. They started flying mortars in while our plane was trying to take off. And I mean, the pilot was, had the pedal to the metal trying to get us out of there and stuff. And that was a nervous moment, because when we finally got airborne and got out of range of these mortars, I mean, the whole plane just erupted in cheers. Everybody survived. It was awesome.
You mentioned drug usage, just a little bit. You hear things again about Vietnam. Do you think it was just because of a sign of the times, the culture back home, or was it just the availability of it, or a combination of both, or was Vietnam so different than other wars that they had to escape into that? And how prevalent was it?
I would say drug use was pretty prevalent, and you have to realize that in that particular war, most of the guys were draftees. They weren't volunteers for the most part. I mean, a few of us were because we chose to join instead of waiting for a draft. But there were a lot of guys who used drugs, particularly marijuana, speed, things like that. And I don't know, I think it reflected maybe just the culture and the time that we were in. It was sort of cool to get high among the guys, and a lot of them came from those kinds of backgrounds and stuff. But there was also an element where the North Vietnamese was, we found out that the North Vietnamese were actually supplying drugs from the North to literally get our troops addicted. And I saw guys getting addicted to some of the purest forms of heroin that anybody had ever seen. And of course, this was a way that they were getting back in America because they knew these guys were going to go back to the States addicted to one form of a drug or another, and that they would become a societal problem to everybody. So it was really kind of a form of warfare now, looking back on it.
What was your spiritual state back then? I mean, had you grown up in a church, and what were your thoughts about God at the time, maybe of Vietnam, and did that help you get through some of the harder times? Or
I wasn't religious when I got to Vietnam. I thought I was immortal. Most young men think they'll never die, you know. I learned pretty quickly that, yeah, you can die, you know, and it can happen pretty quickly, you know. But I had some spiritual experiences in Vietnam that changed my life. I mean, I don't know if it's just that you're reaching for some hope or you're reaching for something more real than what you're seeing around you, but I had a couple of incidents that really turned me around and made me realize that there truly was a spiritual world. And it was only later that I began to connect that with things that I'd read in the Bible or things that people had told me. And after I returned from Vietnam, I was so hungry spiritually. I didn't know who to talk to about it. I wasn't particularly interested in old style religion, you know, but I dabbled a little bit in some of the cults and in yoga and different things. But it wasn't until I met another veteran, a friend of mine who had served in the Army in Europe, who was a neighbor of mine, and we got together and he began to share with me about my faith, about his faith in Jesus Christ, and it clicked. I mean, somehow it all just came together in my heart and my mind, and it was very shortly after that that I accepted Jesus Christ as my personal Savior. And I would add that any wounds that I had emotionally, I can honestly say from the war, God healed those wounds in my life. I mean, my life was changed after I received Christ. And I was wounded. I was emotionally torn inside myself. And, you know, you can't go through that kind of thing without getting some kind of scar from it. But I gave that to Christ. I gave that to God. And I said, God, you know, you're the healer. You can change me. You can make my life different, you know. And I just surrendered to that, and I trusted Him. And over a period of not really more than a few months, I sensed this new sense of life in my life. I mean, he changed my mind. He healed my heart. And He gave me even the ability to forgive the enemy, which was amazing to me.
where did you go to your basic training over here in the States?
I went to Lackland Air Force Base down in San Antonio, Texas.
And then after that, you went to advanced training after that?
Yes. I was up at Rantoul, Urbana, Illinois, Eglin Air Force Base later on in Florida, and then later to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona.
Did you know you'd be going to Vietnam someday during your training, or was that in your thoughts? Or?
It wasn't in my thoughts originally, but after I was based at Tucson, I started meeting guys who had done a tour of duty over there. And I don't know, I had a stirring. I love my country. And I wanted to serve. I wanted to do my part. I wanted to do my duty. That's why I joined. And so it seemed to me that it was the right thing to do, to step up and be counted and to go and serve and do some time there.
Did you lose any close friends during Vietnam, either whether they were with you or just in country from maybe high school, or did you lose anybody that you knew?
Nobody that I knew really closely before going there. I lost a few friends, you know, there. That was, of course, painful. But you know, it was interesting because it wasn't until over 10 years after I came home I went to the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. And I was totally surprised at my reaction, because when I walked up to that black wall and I saw all those names on that wall, I broke down. I mean, I cried like a baby. I sat there on the lawn. My wife thought I was having a nervous breakdown. And I mourned. For the very first time, I mourned my fellow troops. And I felt their pain like I'd never felt it before. And I realized I'd never taken time to mourn anyone or mourn anybody in that war. And so that wall was a healing experience for me. It was very special.
Tell me about the price for freedom.
I'm sure you've heard it many times. Freedom isn't free. I've come to believe in the years since Vietnam and now watching the Iraq conflict and what's going on in other parts of the world now. The world can be a very cruel and evil place, and there are no shortage of people who would take away the freedoms that we have in this country. And if I could volunteer again, I'd go in a heartbeat. I'd be in Iraq right now if I could go. We have to be prepared to pay the ultimate price because it's worth it, because this country's worth defending. No matter what mistakes we've made as a nation, we're still the greatest nation in the world. And I believe in the dream, and I still believe in the dream, and I think it's worth defending.
Good. What does the American flag mean and represent to you as a veteran and an American citizen?
I cry every 4th of July. When I see the flag, it does something in my heart that, because I think God has blessed this great nation. I think that there's some very special purpose that He established this nation for. And that flag represents freedom to me. It represents liberty. And I think that when we honor on the 4th of July the sacrifice that others have made, my sacrifice was minimal compared to the sacrifice that I know others have paid. But it means a whole different thing to me when I see fireworks, because the rockets' red flare, the bombs bursting in air, is not just something beautiful that I look at in the sky on 4th of July. I see men dying when those things go off, and it represents sacrifice to me and love. Love.
What do you think people should remember about Vietnam?
I think with regard to Vietnam, people should remember that war is a nasty business, and we should not enter into a war without careful deliberation. But that once we enter it, once we draw our sword, we should not put it back in its sheath until we have finished the job, until we have won a decisive victory. What happened in Vietnam after we left there was a national shame to our country. 3 million Cambodians plus murdered, slaughtered mercilessly by these Marxist dictators, and hundreds of thousands of boat people and people fleeing Vietnam trying to be free. It should have been something that we should hang our head in shame that we didn't finish the job in Vietnam, and I pray to God that we don't leave Iraq until we have finished the job, because it's worth it, and it saves lives.
There's one World War II veteran told me once, he said that, I don't like war, nobody likes war, but it's something you have to do.
Yeah.
In the sense of, kind of what you were saying there. And but I guess, is there really any glory in war? I mean, you watch a movie, you watch The Sands of Iwo Jima, you watch some of the things even today, but how would you comment on that? Is there glory in war?
There's glory in the victory that leads to lasting peace. There's no glory in the actual war itself, except that there is a demonstration, I believe, of valor and courage on the part of people who participate in wars, especially when they fight nobly and well, and they do their duty. In that sense, there is glory, but it's an unspeakable evil among men that we have wars.
Do you think a lot of this is, as far as the news media, I mean, to me, you either love them or you hate them. I mean, it's like, they have such a position of power to really influence the mindset of this country, the perception of what war is, whether that's reality or not. And sometimes I feel like that we're fighting them too. I mean, as far as what's the American people getting? To me, it's abnormal to stand up and say, I don't agree with what we're doing, and I don't understand that. I'm not really that educated, but I don't find that hard to understand. You know, we need to do some things.
Unfortunately, a lot of the people that are in the news media today are the products of university educations that trained them in really mindless liberalism. I mean, it's a belief basically that there is no evil in the world, that nothing's worth fighting for. Vietnam today represents to me a sad era in our nation's history. It's sad because we were not allowed as military people to win a decisive victory there and prevent the needless slaughter of so many innocent people that we left behind there. I think it's an instructive lesson of what will happen when you have non-military, politically motivated people trying to run a war and micromanage it. And I hope that we've won. I hope that we have learned a lesson from Vietnam that will not repeat again in the present conflicts that we're facing. We're in a situation now where we're about to see a despotic regime in Iran. Iran is about to get the bomb. And if they get the bomb, then the whole equation changes because they are not afraid to use it. We have got to stop them before they do that. And I hope that the liberals in Congress and the politicians will not prevent a victory there and prevent these fanatics from getting a hold of a bomb. We've seen what they're going to do and what they have done in 9/11 when they attacked our nation. What would they do if they had a nuclear weapon? That's a place none of us want to even think about because they wouldn't hesitate. And I'd say the other thing about Vietnam that taught, I think really is a lesson, is that we cannot use conventional warfare methods in a war against guerrillas. You know, insurgents that will not wear uniforms, that are not under the normal command and control structure. We have to adapt to the methods of our enemies and learn to fight effectively to defeat them.
Are you proud that you're a Vietnam veteran?
I am proud of the guys that I served with. I'm proud of the men and even women there who laid their lives down for this country. I came out without the loss of my life or any limbs. I'm thankful for that. But I am honored to have been a part of that campaign. And I look back on it with a certain affection for the people that I served with. And I'll always remember them. I'll never forget the experience.
Do you think it's important that society learns about these things and young people are made aware of why we have what we have in our country through a documentary maybe like this or others?
I think the type of documentary that you're doing is vitally important to the national psyche right now because so many of our young people today are being raised without a real historical perspective on the whys, hows, whens, and wheres of events like Vietnam or even Korea or sadly even World War II. And so many of our young people are not aware that there are conflicts that are just and righteous conflicts, that there are battles that are worth fighting for, there are causes that are worth shedding blood over. And unfortunately, a lot of our people today have been duped into thinking that by being nice and showing a friendly face and negotiating, that somehow we can negotiate with, frankly, monsters. You know, our parents told us there weren't any monsters. They didn't tell the truth. And sometimes we have to go to war to battle them and hold them in check. It's the world that we live in, unfortunately, but I'm looking forward to a better day.
You think a lot of the Vietnam veterans had problems because they were rotated in and out as individuals, not units? And secondly, when they came home, there wasn't this support system in place that really allowed them to transition from combat one day and then being in civilian life the next day. I hear that was from going like from hell back to heaven. There was no transition. Consequently, the statistics show that three times the number of Vietnam veterans killed in the war have killed themselves. I mean, was there a problem with that? The rotation in and out, and just the fact that there was nothing here for them when they got home?
Well, in the Vietnam era, I think it was really the first time that people began to think about post-traumatic stress disorders. There wasn't much known about that. And so a lot of our guys that were really in the thick of combat came back with a lot of issues emotionally and spiritually that they had to just stuff. They couldn't talk to anybody about it. And I think especially with the Vietnam War, it's easier to carry the burden of emotional trauma and having been through warfare and combat if you believe that your cause was just and good and you are honored by those that you served. And the fact that we didn't have victory parades for our Vietnam veterans, that so many of them came back to an atmosphere of shame and scorn and just silence in many cases, it gave them nothing to hang that pain on, that it was worth it. That sense that, what I've been through and what I saw my friends have to go through, there was a just cause. And when you don't have that hook to hang that pain on, then all you can do is carry it, and you're left with feeling like you were a fool for doing it, or that your service was not honored, that you could never wear your medals, because you were supposed to be ashamed of it. And so I think especially Vietnam, we had that syndrome where guys came back and people didn't honor them, they didn't esteem them. And I'm not saying that for myself, but I'm saying that really for the guys that needed that slap on the back. They needed that sense of, honor, that what they gave was worth something.
Have people thanked you for your service in Vietnam?
They have in recent years. Since the first Gulf War, I think a lot of people rethought their attitudes about Vietnam veterans and guys who served during that era. And I think we've seen, a real turnaround, I think, in most of our people's attitudes that, hey, even if you politically were against the war or you thought that it wasn't really a well-advised war worth, fighting, the guys who volunteered or went over there to serve, they did it for the right reasons for the most part. They were there because they were serving their country, just as honorably and just with as much love for their country as the guys who served in World War I or World War II or Korea or any of the other places where our troops have been deployed. And so I have seen a turnaround in that. And lately it's been kind of interesting to hear people say, thank you for your service. It makes me feel good. I'm glad for that. And I think it's also healthy for the people who render that kind of honor. It's good for them to be able to say thank you to a veteran.
Well, I'm going to ask you to do one more thing that I asked all the veterans at the end of my interviews. I'm going to ask you from where you're seated to give me a salute into the camera when I tell you, okay? Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay. Sometimes I get a growl from the Marines, but they do it.
Yeah, they do it grudgingly.
Okay, Bruce, go ahead. Right in the camera. Great, thank you. Excellent.